Right now, something highly unusual is happening in global markets. Over the past year, silver has risen by more than 100%, pushing toward price levels rarely seen in modern trading. Moves of that size don't happen quietly, and they don't happen without a reason. This isn't a typical commodity rally. What makes this different is the timing and the scale. A metal that usually moves in slow cycles has doubled in roughly 12 months, while most investors were looking somewhere else. That alone should raise questions. When I started digging into what changed, I didn't find speculation. I found positioning. And when I compared this setup to historical data, 3 earlier cases stood out immediately. Each time the same pattern appeared. Each time it coincided with the decline of the world's dominant economic power. That's not a coincidence. In this video, I'll walk you through what China appears to have been doing behind the scenes in recent months, why this move matters far beyond silver prices, and 3 developments that become critical as we move into the next stage of this cycle. This isn't about guessing the top. It's about understanding the structure before it becomes obvious. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, and I'm not affiliated with any institution mentioned here. This is educational analysis based on publicly available information. Here's what appears to have happened. In late October, according to multiple trade and customs reports, China's Ministry of Commerce introduced new export controls on silver. Beginning January 1st, silver shipments are expected to require direct government approval, not paperwork delays, formal licensing, export quotas, and what officials describe as national security reviews. In practical terms, this gives China leverage over global silver flows. The market reaction was immediate. Within weeks, reported silver inventories in Shanghai dropped by roughly 40%. Physical premiums inside mainland China surged far beyond global prices. Multiple sources indicate buyers paying between $108 and $128 per ounce for physical metal. That's nearly double the international spot price. When physical trades at that kind of premium, it isn't speculation. It's anticipation of scarcity. At the same time, Western mints began reporting sellouts. London Metal Exchange inventories fell to multi-year lows. Institutional buyers shifted away from paper contracts and began demanding physical delivery. Reported orders totaled roughly 350 million ounces. That amount alone exceeds what many analysts estimate as the entire annual global surplus. This isn't abstract. It affects daily life. Your smartphone contains roughly half a gram of silver. Electric vehicles use between 25 and 50 grams per car. Solar panels require about 20 grams each. And AI data centers, powering systems like ChatGPT, are among the largest silver consumers in modern technology. Each server relies on silver-coated components for heat management and high-speed connectivity. Industry forecasts suggest the AI build-out alone could consume around 200 million ounces of silver by the end of the decade. Defense demand is just as critical. Missiles, radar systems, guidance computers. Public data suggests the U.S. military consumed roughly 15 million ounces in a single recent year. Here's the vulnerability. The United States produces only about 14% of the silver it uses domestically. The rest is imported. And here's what most people misunderstand. China doesn't mine the most silver. Estimates place its mine output around 6% of global production. But China dominates the refining and processing stage. Raw silver from across the world passes through Chinese refiners before becoming high-purity industrial material, and until recently, before being distributed globally. That flow appears to have changed. Now, the common argument is that China wouldn't restrict silver exports because it would hurt their own economy, that this is posturing, negotiation. History suggests otherwise. When I looked back, I found this exact structure repeating 3 times. Different centuries, different commodities. Same progression. And based on the evidence, we've just crossed into stage 3. The pattern unfolds in 4 stages. Stage 1 is dependency. A dominant nation builds its industrial base around a critical material. Factories depend on it. Military systems rely on it. Access is assumed to be unlimited. Stage 2 is weaponization. The supplier recognizes the leverage. Exports are restricted incrementally. Approvals slow. Administrative barriers appear. Scarcity is created without formal bans. Stage 3 is crisis. Prices surge. Production slows. Critical industries begin cutting output. The dependent nation scrambles for alternatives, but the timeline is already compressed. Supply chains don't reroute overnight. Infrastructure can't be rebuilt on demand. By the time substitutes appear, the damage is already done. Stage 4 is realignment. Industrial dominance erodes, currencies weaken, military advantages disappear. A new global order takes shape, not by choice, but by necessity. This pattern isn't theoretical. One historical example mirrors what's unfolding now almost perfectly. By the 1870s, Britain controlled roughly 60% of global manufacturing. The Royal Navy dominated trade routes. The empire appeared unchallengeable, but Britain had a critical vulnerability: steel. They relied heavily on imports from Germany. For decades, the system worked. Germany supplied raw materials. Britain built the ships, machines, and weapons that powered the empire. Then the structure began to shift. Around the 1890s, German steel shipments reportedly started slowing. Not through bans, not through announcements, through delays, extended inspections, administrative friction. British factories missed deadlines, shipyards stalled, steel prices reportedly tripled within a decade. Britain rushed to build domestic capacity, but the clock was already against them. Steel infrastructure takes years, not months. The costs were enormous. By 1914, war erupted. Germany's steel advantage translated directly into military capability. Artillery, machine guns, submarines. Output scaled faster than Britain could match. Britain survived the war, but it never regained industrial dominance. Within 50 years, global leadership had shifted to the United States. Same structure, different resource, same outcome. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. China learned this lesson firsthand. Around 1800, China was the world's largest economy. Europe depended on Chinese goods: silk, porcelain, tea, and China demanded payment in one thing only: silver. By the early 19th century, China had reportedly absorbed nearly half of global silver production. Britain's reserves drained steadily eastward. The British economy began bleeding wealth. Britain found a workaround: opium. They flooded China with opium from India, reversed the silver flow, and turned China's surplus into deficit. When China tried to stop it, Britain invaded. The Opium Wars followed. China lost. Ports were forced open. Hong Kong was ceded. Foreign powers dominated China's economy for over a century. Here's the key point: China never forgot that lesson. Nearly 2 centuries later, they are no longer on the losing side of that equation. They've positioned themselves on the other end of the supply chain. Which brings us back to today. Based on the structure, the timing, and the behavior we're seeing, we are no longer in the early stages. We are in stage 3, and the evidence is already visible. Earlier this year, the United States government formally designated silver as a critical mineral. That designation isn't symbolic. It's an admission that supply has become a strategic vulnerability. According to multiple industry estimates, cumulative global silver deficits now exceed 800 million ounces. That's not a one-year anomaly. It's the result of roughly 5 consecutive years where demand outpaced supply. Production hasn't caught up, and structurally, it can't. Here's the core problem. Roughly 70% of global silver production comes as a byproduct of other mining operations. Silver isn't mined on its own. It comes out of copper, lead, and zinc projects. You don't just open a new silver mine because prices rise. If copper demand slows, silver supply falls with it, regardless of how high silver prices go. That makes rapid supply expansion structurally impossible. The constraints are already visible. Reports indicate solar panel manufacturers are experiencing delays. Electric vehicle production timelines are tightening. AI chip manufacturers are actively searching for substitutes. But here's the technical reality. Silver has the highest electrical conductivity of any element. Its thermal conductivity is unmatched. In high-performance applications, there is no viable replacement, not for military systems, not for advanced AI infrastructure, not for next-generation power systems. The Pentagon understands this. Defense contractors understand this. Silicon Valley understands this. And China understands that they understand. Industry forecasts now point to potential silver shortfalls exceeding 200 million ounces next year alone. That's roughly 15% of annual global demand, simply unavailable. Current prices are hovering around $60 per ounce. Public forecasts from major banks cluster in the mid-60s over the next year or two. But that's not the full picture. What isn't being discussed publicly is what happens if restrictions remain in place and deficits continue to compound. In private, some analysts are talking about $75 to $100 per ounce, not in a decade, within 18 months. So, what happens next? There are only three realistic paths. Option 1. The United States pays whatever price is required. Silver prices surge, costs ripple through supply chains, manufacturers pass those costs on. Your smartphone gets more expensive, electric vehicles cost more. Electricity prices rise because silver is embedded in modern infrastructure. Option 2. The United States tries to source silver elsewhere. Mexico, Peru, Canada, Australia. But most major producers are already operating near capacity, and China can outbid competitors with trillions in foreign reserves. More importantly, China controls much of the global refining process. Raw ore isn't usable, it has to be processed. And processing is where leverage lives. Option 3 is the United States building domestic refining capacity. In theory, this is the only sustainable solution. In reality, it takes years, possibly a decade. Permits, environmental reviews, construction, testing, certification. By the time that infrastructure is operational, China has likely already locked in long-term advantages. More advanced AI infrastructure, a more mature green energy grid, a larger electric vehicle fleet, and lower input costs across strategic industries. The United States would be rebuilding from behind. We've seen this pattern before. Britain tried to expand domestic steel production after years of relying on Germany. The response came too late. The timeline was compressed. The outcome was already set. The United States is now trying to secure silver supply after decades of relying on China's refining network. History suggests the same constraint applies. So what do you do with this information? Three conclusions matter. First, understand the timeline. China's export controls are expected to move from announcement to enforcement as we enter the new year. That window is measured in weeks, not years. Once enforcement tightens, markets don't adjust gradually. They gap. If you operate in industries dependent on silver, electronics, solar, automotive, defense, this needs to be factored into planning now, not after prices reset. Second, recognize what's already diverging. Physical silver and paper silver are no longer behaving as the same asset. Inside China, buyers are reportedly paying close to double the quoted paper price for actual metal. That spread isn't noise, it's a signal. It represents a disconnect between futures contracts and physical reality. When that gap closes in Western markets, and historically it always does, the adjustment is fast and violent. Third, watch what happens over the next 90 days, if enforcement tightens, if inventories continue falling, if more countries begin securing strategic reserves. That confirms we're locked into stage 3. At that point, the window for easy solutions closes. And here's the larger issue. This isn't just about silver. In my analysis, China is testing whether the United States responds decisively. If Washington hesitates on silver, the next move becomes obvious. Rare earth elements, tungsten, antimony, cobalt. This looks less like a single trade dispute and more like a systematic effort to control the supply chains of the 21st century economy. Silver may simply be the opening move. For 2 centuries, China watched the West control critical resources. Britain dominated steel. America dominated oil. The dollar dominated trade. That dynamic appears to be reversing. 800 million ounces missing. 4 historical stages. Stage 3 underway. The structure is visible. The timeline is tightening. The only real question is whether you recognize it while there's still time. In my next analysis, I'll break down which industries are most exposed first, which business models are most vulnerable, and the moves institutional players are already making quietly before this shows up in headlines. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're approaching the point where understanding this early matters far more than reacting later.